Naturally, as soon as I make a video stating that I won't be making videos for a few months, someone makes a reply to one of my old videos out of the blue. I made several response videos about the subjective ethics of the vegan YouTuber Isaac, aka Ask Yourself, to which he never responded to other than by making some text comments. Soon after I made those videos, Ask Yourself deleted all of his content, so I thought that was it for him. But he apparently started over and continues to make response videos to other YouTubers, usually regarding speciesism. He's best known for a hashtag, Name the Trait, which puts it to the speciesist to name a reason why a pig or a cow should be a meat slave when human slavery is considered to be unethical by that same person. It exposes hypocrisy. And that is what I was trying to accomplish with my videos toward natalist vegans. It's hypocritical to be against breeding animals for the slaughterhouse, but be for breeding humans and wild animals into an island planet that is also essentially a carnage slaughterhouse. This exchange started when Ask Yourself made a video titled Meta-Ethics a couple of years ago. It's deleted now. It was shocking to me that a vegan activist could hold such nihilistic views. After all of the response videos I made to him back then, he finally decided to rewatch one of my old videos and make a response back. So I suppose I should make a final reply. And I say final because you cannot have a productive, rational argument with an ethical subjectivist, or as I'll refer to him, a nihilist, because he is irrational. Stubbornly and arrogantly irrational. He seems to think that bravado can make up for a ludicrous argument. Many of his subscribers seem to buy into it. I feel sad for them. They're trying to learn philosophy from a crazy person, and they don't realize it. He said that my video was, quote, bad, so I guess he didn't like the drawing I did of him. Ask Yourself seems to prefer this older, smug sketch of himself that he's been using for years now as his avatar. So instead of drawing him again, I think it's time I did a new self-portrait, as my haircut has changed since the last one I did. If any of you are fans of Schopenhauer, you will probably recognize this pose from a famous photo of him leaning on a table. I thought it might make sense for me to be leaning on the works of Schopenhauer and Benatar. Hopefully someday there will be an Efilist book, because I also lean heavily on the philosophy of Inmendham. I'm going to be using a grid to speed up this drawing. It makes nailing a likeness much easier and faster without having to resort to tracing. If any of you are familiar with Inmendham's back and forth with Hothloday from about 5 years ago, that's basically what this video will be. A reply to a solipsistic Kantian subjectivist who denies reality. However, at least Hothloday understood that arbitrary ethics fail, so he seemed to understand philosophy better than Ask Yourself. Unfortunately, Ask Yourself doesn't really define or explain the antinatalist position to his audience, and instead gets hung up on so-called logic problems from hundreds of years ago. He refuses to actually take on the antinatalist argument, that is, there is no need to create need, and instead he prefers to talk about how I apparently don't understand contradictions. It is actually hard for me to make a reply video like this because typing really hurts my hands, and I've had to take a lot of notes from this 20-minute video and then type a response. That is another reason why I prefer to work on art projects right now, because drawing doesn't hurt my hand as nearly as bad as typing and mousing. I have cubital tunnel syndrome, in case you haven't been watching my previous videos, but if I spread this out, I can still manage to do it. Isaac invited me to a debate on his Discord server, but after this I don't really see any reason to continue the discussion because the two of us are just too far away philosophically to come to any kind of consensus. So Ask Yourself is what is called an ethical subjectivist, relativist, or anti-realist. This is someone who thinks that truth value comes from the attitudes, or what he calls values, of the individual, not from objective reality. So that's why he's so obsessed with using internal logic to make arguments rather than evidentiary fact claims about reality. Like, I assume that this is the type of video that Ask Yourself enjoys.
And if it is true that it is the case that statements can contradict and cannot contradict, and not the case that statements can contradict and not contradict, then that statement should be able to contradict and not contradict, and not be able to contradict and not contradict.
I also call him a nihilist because he thinks that all ethical claims are void of any objective truth value, and that's close enough for me. Internal logic proofs are not as interesting as scientific discoveries about the universe, history, psychology, art, and all of the facts you can learn about the world to help inform your opinions, actions, and your activism. I don't need to study the math behind the law of non-contradiction because it is a self-evident truth. I can move on in trying to see the bigger picture. I don't think that nihilists are really helping anything. It is self-evident that reality is not hypothetical. There's enough evidence that it exists. There's no reasonable reason why we should still be playing these games in philosophy anymore. It's non-commonsensical to be an anti-realist. If you were to apply anti-realism to science, then you'd get disbelief in unobservable objects and phenomena like electrons and genes, which doesn't make sense because we know for a fact that they do exist.
So Life Sucks doesn't understand the is-ought problem. It's a problem of logical deduction. How do you move from descriptive premises to a normative conclusion by valid inference? That is, how do you move from is premises to an ought conclusion by valid inference? If you think you have such an inference, let's see it. So he says something like, Avi, you're a medical doctor. Isn't it obvious that if someone's bleeding out in front of you, you ought save them? Isn't it obvious that if a cow is tortured for steak, you oughtn't buy steak? Well, look, those might be Avi's values. He might value saving the person or not buying the steak, but that in no way implies that he needs or has a valid inference that moves from descriptive premises to a normative conclusion, and it certainly doesn't imply that you do either. So again, if you think you have the inference, let's see it. Then you say, this is basic logic. Well, it's funny because this is a logical problem. It's a problem of deduction, but you don't provide the inference, right? So again, let's see the inference.
I do understand where he is coming from a bit better with the is-ought gap after watching his video and revisiting the concept, but you have to be a nihilist or a subjectivist to care about it and actually use it as an argument to debunk antinatalism. Hume himself had oughts from ises in his own philosophy, and I don't think he meant it to become the rule or law that people like Sean Carroll and Ask Yourself use it as. The standard interpretations of Hume state that there are no deductively valid inferences whose premises contain no oughts and whose conclusions contain oughts. Ask Yourself is basically saying that it's not that you ought not derive an ought from an is, it's that you logically cannot without a frame of reference, so without stating some underlying assumption or goal. The conclusion doesn't follow the premise based on the formal rules of logic, so he says, is incomplete in his view. So he's basically saying that pain is bad as a premise has to have a judgment or normative theory attached to it, and therefore it's like saying blue is pretty, a subjective opinion. However, blue is pretty is a subjective judgment, but there is nothing subjective about pain being bad. So that is where we disagree. I don't consider it to be a fallacy to use a premise that has an ought, such as pain is bad. Because of evolution, the ought is built into pain. The ought can't be ignored. Pain equals avoidance. They're almost synonyms. It's intrinsically negative. Pain is, and it ought to be avoided. There is no deductive gap here because the description can't be separated from its ethical truth value. Hume's law is a fallacy when applied to a premise conclusion like pain is bad. Pain ought to be avoided. Now, when it is applied to something like God is good, the Bible is the Word of God, therefore we ought to use the Bible as a basis for ethics. This fails because the premises make assumptions that aren't backed by any evidence. So, for religious morality, there are all kinds of mile-wide gaps between premise and conclusion. To me, it is illogical to put a gap between is and ought when it comes to a sentient mind in crisis. The ought is intrinsic, so Hume's rule is nonsensical. Some say you can easily bypass the supposed gap by including an if in your premises, such as pain exists, if pain makes life unbearable, then pain ought to be avoided, something like that. In the end, this is all just semantics again. It's far from being the most interesting thing the two of us could be talking about. If I could just ignore the arbitrary way he comes to veganism, it would be better if we talked about something that had more utility, like how do we become more effective activists? How will we actually achieve animal liberation? How is it consistent for an ethical vegan to also be an ethical Dr. Frankenstein? So, I'm not sure if Isaac just likes explaining Hume to me or if he thinks the argument actually counters antinatalism, i.e. because of Hume's law it is ethical for a vegan to procreate. But if that is ethical according to him, then it would also be ethical to purchase animal products.
You quote Sam Harris, who in his quote does not provide a valid inference that moves from descriptive premises to a normative conclusion, so not really getting the answer there either. And it's also just worth noting on the side, Sam Harris is a notorious misunderstander of the is-ought problem. People who do understand the problem, like Sean Carroll, have attempted to explain it to Sam, but he doesn't seem to get it. I'll link a video down below of Sean Carroll trying to get this through Sam's head. And here's a nice little clip from that video where Carroll explains the problem very concisely.
You are a fan of Hume's parsing of this matter, so perhaps give me the reasons why not from the Hume side, and then we can...
Sure. I think that there's two slightly different claims. One would be the claim that you can derive ought from is, which I think is just manifestly wrong. That's just logically wrong, right? By the rules of logic, garbage in, garbage out. Values in, values out, facts in, facts out. By using the rules of deductive logic, you cannot derive conclusions about properties that did not somehow appear in the axioms or the premises from which you did your logic. So I think that's just a non-starter. I think that is a straightforward computational science claim, that you can't do the logic from there. Now, even if you believe that claim, which everyone should believe, you could still argue about moral realism versus anti-realism. It's totally possible to be a moral realist and a moral objectivist and still admit that you can't derive ought from is.
So, yeah, if you think you have a valid inference that moves from descriptive premises to a normative conclusion, then let's see it, and if not, let's see a retraction of this critique.
Isaac quotes a discussion between Sam Harris and quantum physicist Sean Carroll, and I listened to it, and I liked how Sam said earlier in the podcast to put your hand on a hot stove and the ought will be intrinsically obvious without using any philosophy at all. But this example of pain being bad as an inference to action will not be good enough for Isaac or Sean Carroll. Nothing will be a good enough inference for them because they don't believe that suffering experience or a description of it can be bad without a normative concept like utility to go along with it. So it seems that the is-ought problem is a semantic, nonsensical, 300-year-old concept that a rational thinker need not be concerned about. Sean Carroll believes in the multiverse like in DC comic books, so he's not a very rational person, despite being a physicist and an atheist. Sam Harris is a utilitarian, so of course he's going to be at odds with the kooky made-up physics and nonsensical gap problems that aren't really problems. And of course, for me being a utilitarian, I find Harris's perspective to be the more rational one.
Just is claims about the situation we're in. We all will have this preference not to burn in fire for eternity, right?
So what?
That's of the nature of what it is to be a conscious being and the difference between burning in fire and not, right? And there are right answers with respect to how to avoid that. So this is just a description of the situation.
Do I want to avoid it?
Yeah.
Should I?
No, but you want to avoid it, and there's a way to avoid it.
Should I avoid it? Should you avoid it? Should I make other people avoid it?
But the should is derivable from the feeling of how bad it is to be in fire for eternity.
If we assume that we should avoid the feeling of being in fire for all eternity.
But what I'm saying is that the claim, the question, the place that it seems
would be
like
very liberating for you to just say, yes, we should assume that.
Well, but I just don't see there's no alternative. Well, like if you actually,
if there's no alternative, then we should certainly do it.
But it's not even an operation. That's what I'm saying. If there's no alternative, the gesture it can't even be made.
So you can see how insane Carroll's view is. He just said, why should you avoid burning in hell? Can one ask a more stupid question? And this is a person who wrote a book about the existence of the DC multiverse. That's nihilism right there, or as Inmendham calls it, denialism. I like how Inmendham recently said that the is-ought gap could only really apply to a computer or a robot. A feeling sentient being doesn't have the luxury of ignoring pain and suffering in themselves and realize it also exists in others. To ignore that is being nihilistic. It's the kind of reasoning that makes people think philosophy is bullshit. I agree with Sam Harris that some of these so-called philosophical problems are not problems at all. I mean, he's talking about a flawed logical argument from 1740, before Darwin, before Bentham, before the USA even existed. So what I would say to Isaac is that it's not that myself, Sam Harris, Inmendham, and other utilitarians don't understand the is-ought gap. It's that we don't think it can be applied to intrinsically negative facts like suffering. It is crazy to me that Sam Harris is not even a vegetarian, but is pro-war, and he's got a ways to go still. I guess that's the power of tradition and addiction. I don't understand why all utilitarians aren't vegan, and I don't know why all vegans aren't anti-natalists. The reason why Ask Yourself doesn't think that facts and reality relate directly to ethics is because he doesn't believe in the importance of consequences. He's incorrect that the is-ought problem is a problem for consequentialists. It's only a problem for non-realists and nihilists. This is why Sam Harris talks about a science of morality, or ethics as a science, which it is. If reality cannot inform our decisions of right and wrong, good and bad, then what can? Our subjective opinion? Isaac is using philosophy from the 18th and 19th centuries. He's arguing for subjectivism or idealism, a notion that everyone's idea of what is right and wrong is different and dependent on how they see the world, not on how the world actually is. Harris states that ethics has to come from facts about reality, from scientific discoveries, not from internal logic that denies that a description about reality can on its own give us a direction for action. I wish this video was actually about antinatalism. Why can't he just say, it is better to come into existence than to not come into existence because blank. Or a vegan who is against the torturing of animals, who then procreates, i.e. places a sentient being into harm, is not a hypocrite because fill in the blank. But no, we have to talk about gaps from 300 years ago. Spring is like water pouring out of millions of taps. Another tap is being turned on every 2 seconds. For every 2 seconds, a human being comes into existence. It's not subjective, it's an objective problem. But natalist vegans want to not only keep the taps on, but to turn on more taps and bring more suffering into existence. All because they don't believe in objective value.
Well, there's another basic error by Life Sucks. Obviously, you can be an objectivist natalist, so it doesn't make any sense to say that natalists are such in virtue of not being objectivists, right? What about the objectivist natalists? So unless you think that you can show that that position entails a contradiction, then let's see a retraction of this claim that natalists are such in virtue of not being objectivists.
Ugh, he uses unnatural vegan as some example of a realist natalist. She's one of the biggest hypocrites on YouTube, so she can only be an example of a cruel and confused human being. I didn't know that she was a realist because I don't watch her pro-natalist channel. She's a professional troll and an extremely stupid and obnoxious contrarian. If Isaac didn't like my use of the word contradiction, then he can feel free to replace it with the word inconsistent. It is inconsistent for someone to claim to be a vegan for ethical reasons, which is a position against imposing harm unnecessarily, who then imposes harm unnecessarily on a human animal. She is a hypocrite, and an imposer of torture and death.
Well, if you think that threshold deontology is inconsistent, then derive the contradiction. And if you can't do so, then let's see a retraction of this claim that threshold deontology is inconsistent.
If you don't even know what normative system you should use, then you're just confused. Consequences and rules give you different answers to ethical questions. Like, should I lie to a Nazi that there are Jews in the basement? A deontologist would refuse to lie, even to prevent harm. Clearly, it's a completely different and less useful system than utilitarianism. I already said all of this in my previous videos. It seems like the problem is that he is trying to mash his personal values into some system of ethics that may fit it, like a square peg in a round hole, rather than having value understandings come from reality and consequences. So he has his ethics backwards. You don't get to try and fit ethics into your personal subjective desires. What you call values have to be based on something real. Reality determines what is right and wrong, and what is ought, and what is not ought, not you. His system seems like it would be inconsistent even among practitioners of this system. That doesn't seem like a philosophy that I would want to use. These philosophical questions like should we bear children are just too important. I don't know why he says I didn't provide an argument. I mean, I'm not making videos with just ad hom attacks. I'm critiquing the fact that you cannot be both an atheist and a theist. You cannot be a Kantian and a utilitarian at the same time. That's a contradiction.
Well, if you think threshold deontology doesn't make any sense, then you could always, give an argument to that effect. That's usually a good thing to do. But yeah, I think that the system is pretty straightforward, and it seems to do a better job of approximating my own values than any other normative system that I'm aware of. So the idea is you place some value on utility, you place some value on rights, and you take both into consideration when evaluating the morality of a given action. So take, for example, the trolley problem. This is a classic, right? There's a trolley on trajectory to hit 5 people. There's a switch that you can flip, and if you do so, then the trolley will be redirected such that it only hits 1 person. So it's a choice between 2 possible worlds. In possible world 1, more people die, but no rights violation occurs. In possible world 2, less people die, but a rights violation occurs. So which is the right decision to make? Flip the switch or don't flip the switch? The utilitarian is going to want to say flip the switch because utility is higher in the possible world where less people die. The deontologist is going to want to say don't flip the switch because a rights violation occurs in the world in which less people die. What would the threshold deontologist say? Well, it depends on their threshold, but the point is that they can give different answers, right? They can say no, don't flip the switch at 5 people, but yes, flip the switch at 10,000 people. So here's a little graph, okay? The D line is deontology, the C line is consequentialism, which for the purpose of this video I'm using interchangeably with utilitarianism, and the T line is threshold deontology. The x-axis is utility, and the y-axis is moral value. So going one by one, if you look at the C line, you can see that the moral value, that is the y-coordinate, is negative when utility, the x-coordinate, is negative, is neutral when utility is neutral, and is positive when utility is positive. If you look at the D line, this is for a specific rights violation, let's say murder, you can see that the moral value, again, the y-coordinate, is always equally negative regardless of the utility, that is the x-coordinate. And if you look at the T line, it's just the sum of the C line and the D line. To get a sense of the T line, let's just take the trolley problem and vary the amount of people who the trolley's on trajectory to hit. We're not going to vary the amount of people who will be hit if the trolley's redirected. We'll just leave that stable at 1 person. And let's just assign some arbitrary values. We'll say that the wrongness of the rights violation of flipping the switch on someone is -5 moral points. And let's say that the utility of each life saved is 1 util. Those are, again, just arbitrary assignments. So let's say the trolley's on trajectory to hit 1 person. If you don't flip the switch, 1 person dies. If you flip the switch, 1 person dies. So there's no utility difference between those 2 possible worlds, and the utility of the action consequently is 0. And the moral value consequently on utilitarianism is 0. Of course, the moral value on deontology is going to be -5. So the moral value on threshold deontology, 0 plus -5, is going to be -5. It's wrong to flip the switch if the trolley's on trajectory to hit 1 person. Say it's on trajectory to hit 2 people. So if you don't flip the switch, 2 people die. If you flip the switch, 1 person dies. The utility differential between those 2 possible worlds is 1. So you're going to have the action having 1 utility point, consequently a value of 1 on consequentialism. And then on deontology, since you're flipping the switch, it's going to have a value of -5. 1 plus -5 is going to give you -4. So it's still wrong on threshold deontology, but not as wrong as flipping the switch when the trolley's on trajectory to hit 1 person. Obviously, you can see where this is going. Say that it's on trajectory to hit 6 people. So if you don't flip the switch, 6 people die. If you flip the switch, then 1 person dies. The utility differential between those 2 possible worlds is 5 utils, and consequently the moral value of the action on utilitarianism is 5. When you add the moral wrongness from deontology, which is -5, then you come out to an overall moral value of 0. So it's neutral to flip the switch on threshold deontology when 6 people are on trajectory to be hit by the trolley. And then any number after that, it's actually going to be positive, and increasingly so, to flip the switch on threshold deontology. Also, just as an aside, I'll mention that my deontic impulse isn't really that strong in the trolley case. It's a lot stronger in cases like a rape that maximizes utility. So that's the idea. Seems to make perfect sense to me. Now, if all you want to say is that threshold deontology doesn't approximate your values well, then that's fine. I'd be okay with a criticism like that. But if you want to say the kind of things you've been saying earlier, like that it doesn't make sense or that it's inconsistent, those kind of claims would require arguments. So let's either see an argument to that effect or get a concession that those points were wrong.
To me, this is just ridiculous, and no, it doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, it's a simple question. Should we run over more or less people? It seems pretty obvious what the answer is. People like Ask Yourself just want philosophy to be complicated when it's dead simple. By the time he's done with his arbitrary graph, this is what the scene would look like. A utilitarian would know what to do immediately, all things being equal, i.e. all 6 people are vegan antinatalists, And a Kantian would also know immediately what not to do, because they think that interference would be a rights violation. A person holding two opposing ethical systems at the same time would have to use some arbitrary formula to come up with a solution. This is doing the exact opposite of Occam's razor. He's going for the most complicated solution. Either consequences matter, or they do not matter. They can't be both at the same time. I mean, if someone says you haven't made an argument when you clearly have, what else can you say? I'm saying deontology sucks. It disregards consequences, and consequences are all that matter. Why doesn't Isaac prove that they don't? I don't throw around words like he's claiming. I pick them with great care. He is the one who needs to justify this dual system when he could just be a consequentialist. Two people getting squished is double the amount of harm of only one person getting squished on the other track. In that long-winded explanation he just gave, he never said why he can justify letting two people get horribly killed and mutilated over one. So this is what I see as a rational philosophy where physical reality, or nature, is the basis for everything else. But Ask Yourself seems to perceive that the agent, or the one viewing reality, is the source of everything else. So for metaethics, we have here on the side anti-realism, along with subjectivism and moral nihilism. Then he goes from the agent's attitudes to the arbitrary coin flip about what normative theory he is going to use, and then he subjectively picks one and comes to an ethical position. I call it an arbitrary coin flip or dice roll because he said that the source of value to him is the opinion of the agent. So two different people will have two completely different answers to the same question, and I don't see how that's very useful. I do wonder where people learn philosophy like this. In college, it was just easy for me to understand that Kant was made-up nonsense, and Schopenhauer had the better understanding of life. Bentham and Mill added the utility concept, and Spock was a utilitarian, so I had that carry over from childhood, and that all made sense to me. I don't know how someone discovers nihilism and arbitrary ethics and decides, oh yeah, that seems right. Maybe Nietzsche is their introduction to philosophy and that fucks them up. I don't know. When I was a teenage atheist, I read a little Nietzsche because I liked the God is dead concept, but other than that, his writings did nothing for me.
The claims that Life Sucks makes are just so bold, it's amazing. I mean, look, there's reasonable criticisms you could make of subjectivism. You could be like, subjectivism is a theory of public moral language, and it seems to not be tracking how we're using moral language a lot of the time, and then try to give, counterexamples to that effect, and then say, therefore, it's not really a good theory. That would be one thing. That could be an interesting discussion, but Life Sucks is saying it's illogical. I mean, I think he's one of those guys who just throws around words like illogical or inconsistent without realizing how bold the claims are that he's making. But look, if you think it's illogical, let's see an argument showing that subjectivism entails a contradiction. Subjectivism is the conjunction of three propositions, that moral statements express propositions, that at least one such proposition is true, and that the truth makers for such propositions are people's attitudes. Now, if you can't derive a contradiction, let's see a retraction of that claim that subjectivism is illogical.
The video is over halfway done and he still hasn't offered one defense of natalism. I already stated in many videos why subjectivism is dumb, because reality is objective, therefore to be subjective about something that is objectively true is irrational. Your third proposition says that truth comes from people's attitudes. That is where we diverge. If you look up ethical naturalism, you'll get a different claim. 1. Ethical sentences express propositions. 2. Some such propositions are true. 3. These propositions are made true by objective features of the world, independent of human opinion. So I don't see why Isaac isn't getting it. Your opinion doesn't matter. Pain is bad is outside of either of our opinions. It's something that can't be denied. Subjectivism has more to do with religious or cult theology, where a person's interpretation of scripture or God's word leads to a dogma about what is right and what is wrong. I don't remember if I said subjectivism is a contradiction, but it is illogical. All illogical means is that it doesn't make sense. It is unreasonable to me for Ask Yourself to deny objective facts in favor of subjective opinions. Everyone could have a subjective, arbitrary opinion on something. How is that a sound basis for ethics? He says it's on me to show where he is wrong, but how has he shown that I'm wrong? I haven't heard him debunk realism yet. Isaac, I don't have to show a contradiction to say that something is illogical. All I have to do is show that it's unreasonable. You are being unreasonable when you say that a subjective agent's personal opinion matters more than objective facts about reality. You have your source of value mixed up. I don't have to imagine any other worlds than the world we exist in. You have also failed to define what well-being even is. There only is one world with large amounts of suffering and some relief from that suffering. Sam Harris is claiming that jerking off moments outweigh the sufferings of life, and I'm arguing that he's wrong. The argument of the Anti-Natalist is that you and others like Sam Harris are guilty of a logical fallacy called Pollyannaism, or the optimism bias. Your senses reveal a world of horror, malice, disease, distress, and death. And yet you claim that it's not just okay, it's great. It's an overall positive experience. And you are wrong. In a video I made years ago, I asked him to name the well-being. What is so great about life? That's all I'm asking. It's a simple question. What is so great about life? There is no well-being. There's only less or more suffering. There are no peaks on the moral landscape, only depressions and valleys of varying depths.
He doesn't realize that he keeps making claims that require him to demonstrate contradiction. Like when he says that threshold deontology is inconsistent or subjectivism is illogical. It's like, what's the argument that either of those positions entail a contradiction? And now he's talking about Sam Harris's moral landscape. So he's saying that there's no worlds that are peaks, and there's no worlds where the well-being is higher than the suffering. Presumably that's what he means. So what the fuck is the argument for that? Why would someone accept a claim like that? Can you show that it's contradictory to talk about a possible world that has more well-being than suffering, or even a world that has only well-being and no suffering? I don't think so. Now, I'm going to kind of give him like a dilemma here, okay? So you can pick your horn. So the one horn is you use the language of well-being and suffering in the same kind of way as everyone else, and you address the critique that I just gave, right? You show that there's a contradiction in positing a possible world that has more well-being than suffering. But on the other hand, because I think he might be trying to do something like this, if he's using language differently than all of us, if he's referring to what we're all referring to as well-being, as suffering, then sure, we can grant that there's no worlds with more well-being than suffering because we've just like eliminated well-being as a concept, but it's no longer going to be the case that suffering is necessarily a bad thing, at least not to most of us, right? Because if the world where I'm a billionaire, everyone lives forever, we can just spend our time like laughing and having fun and like learning about the universe and just being in like transcendental bliss, and I have a Batmobile. Like if that world, he looks at that and he goes, that's like maybe like a -2. It's like, okay, sure, all of the worlds are suffering on your view, but that's just because you're using the word in a different way than us, right? You're just referring to the thing that we'd refer to as well-being as a degree of suffering. Pick your poison. You can have whichever horn of the dilemma you want. If you're using language in the same way as us, then show that it's a contradiction to posit a world with more well-being than suffering. And if you're not using the language in the same way as us and you're just calling everything that we're calling well-being degrees of suffering, then I think most people are just going to not accept that what you're calling suffering is even a bad thing.
Well, then he kind of does say what's so great about it. He mentions wealth, fun, immortality, basically a transhumanist fantasy that would make up for all the suffering and death in the world. And I'm not using the word suffering differently than everyone else at all. This world of bliss he's talking about isn't reality. Are animals still eating each other's faces in this world? Are slaughterhouses still producing slaughter? Do people still die? I mean, if you're immortal, wouldn't that get boring? And boredom is a form of suffering. I will again mention the story of the ones who walk away from Omelas, which I mentioned in my other response to him. Even if one child has to live a life of torture, then the joy you get from driving the Batmobile around Omelas doesn't really mean much as far as positive value goes, does it? I don't think he really understands negative utilitarianism. It's like a financial deficit. If you're $1 million in the red, then making $10 doesn't count as a profit. And that is what I'm claiming about life. It's a 500 million year old hole full of bodies, and we're not going to be paying that back anytime soon. He's picking apart the critiques of subjectivism in my video, but I really would like it if these responses to the philosophy would just answer the question, is it good to make a victim that can and will be tortured to death by life? But he's a subjectivist Kantian, so he's just going to say something like, because you can't derive should from a could, we can't know if it's ethical to create life and death. His philosophy, I will admit, does not make much sense to me. We appear to be just as philosophically different as a Christian and an atheist. We are just worlds away, and I don't see any way of changing that, because he certainly hasn't convinced me to embrace his arbitrary ethics. Anti-Natalism consistently follows the vegan philosophy of avoiding unnecessary harm, and procreation fits the description of unnecessary harm. Tell me where I'm being inconsistent there. He kind of reminds me of those Unitarian Universalists who think that they can combine all of the religions and somehow make sense out of it.
Except for his weird moral objectivism, it's obvious claims, but yes.
Well, it is nice. I will say it is nice to have people concerned about animal rights on all sides of the table, right?
Yes.
Even if there are mortal enemies and meta-ethics.
Mm-hmm.
It's so obvious, so obviously true that we, should be vegan, that even these insane moral realists.
This is a good example of subjectivist habit of making contradictions. He says that animal rights is so obviously true, yet he says moral realism is insane. Well, if that truth is self-evident, then why isn't objective value? It makes no sense. Subjectivists always contradict themselves. It's one of their tells.
Life Sucks clearly has no idea what a contradiction is, and I think it's his general lack of understanding of basic logic, at least in part, that allows him to throw around terms like inconsistent, impossible, or contradictory where they clearly don't belong and couldn't be defended. There's no statement of the form P and not P, which is what a contradiction is, that's entailed by JHC saying that it's obviously true that we should be vegan and moral realism is insane.
So Isaac seems to be demanding a very specific use of the word. Like an example, A is A and A is not A, which is a contradiction. Like saying Isaac is 6 feet tall and Isaac is 4 foot tall. Those statements are inconsistent and can be called a contradiction. If I say Isaac is a consequentialist and Isaac is a deontologist, you see where I'm coming from calling this a contradiction. But he rejects that and says no. Isaac is a consequentialist and Isaac is not a consequentialist because he believes that you can hold two opposing philosophical ideas at the same time. And I'm saying, no, you cannot. Utility and rule-based ethics are completely different systems, and when you heard him try to explain it, you can just see how ridiculous it sounds. Deontology and subjectivism seem like a more me-focused philosophy rather than an us-focused philosophy like utilitarianism. We're all in this together, whether you like it or not, so it's rational to include others and their experiences into your ethical equations. Ask Yourself says that what the guy really meant was that he feels veganism is obviously true. I don't know why he keeps claiming that I don't know what a contradiction is. This guy was saying that he can't know anything for certain and then says that something is obviously true when he just said nothing is true, everything is subjective. So we can't know if veganism is right, but it's right. So he's holding two different beliefs at the same time, holding the belief that avoidable harm is bad regarding births for the meat industry, but also holding the belief that avoidable harm is good regarding births in general, in the wild and by natalists, and that contradicts his first belief. Obviously, pro-natalists like Ask Yourself think that the two are different, but they are alike enough for me to hold the understanding that birth is bad, period, and there is no justification for the imposition of the risk and the non-consensual death sentence that it causes. He says that value equals desire, so we completely disagree there. What I desire is irrelevant. It's what I do that matters. I don't know, maybe Isaac hasn't seen the worst of life yet. I'm talking about value like currency, like the value of a dollar. A dollar is worth how many minutes of difficult labor? A human life is worth how many years of dementia? They are saying that there is no external or objective truth, and I'm saying that the evidence points to that being wrong.
Well, whether it's reasonable or not to call me a nihilist kind of depends on what you mean by value. So it's not as if I have no concept of what value is. I take value to refer to our desires. If I say that I value that cancer be cured, I'm saying I desire that cancer be cured. But if you're talking about some kind of robustly real notion of value, then yeah, I'm not convinced that something like that exists. And if you are, then you can define what you mean and then provide an argument for its existence.
So he did understand my claim that he is a nihilist correctly, And I think they reinforced it when he said that value, in an objective sense, does not exist. He offers no evidence for that claim, but just says that he's not convinced. Then, as he has done throughout this video, he puts it to me to prove that sentient suffering has value. His nihilism cannot be a rational philosophy, because if nothing can be proven to be real, then why give animals or human suffering any kind of ethical consideration? He believes that what is considered right or wrong is the individual's perceptions, opinions, experiences, inclinations, and desires. So for him, ethics, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. If right is what each person thinks is right, then can anything be wrong? Why does he bother debating with Carnus if only what a person thinks is right? Then no one would ever need to change his or her moral point of view. If ethics has no oughts, then there is no such thing as ethics. An ethical subjectivist can never condemn the moral decisions and actions of others, but he does, supposedly based on his own personal subjective desires, or as he calls them, values. The difference between us is that he believes ethics is an invention of human beings rather than something that is discovered. If dolphins evolved the parts of the brain that are required for language, and they became intelligent, then what is good and what is bad would be there for them to discover. The same goes for an intelligent being that evolved in another galaxy. It would be there for them to discover as well. In other words, you need fertile soil, facts, to grow a plant with strong roots, which would be your ethical positions. Subjectivism has no soil because they believe that the soil does not exist, so they cannot grow any strong-rooted plants. All they have to work with are stringy, easily torn-up weeds. Sam Harris believes that it is part of practicing rational ethics to exclude and ignore solipsists, nihilists, and anti-realists. They bring nothing to the discussion of ethics and essentially just pollute philosophy with unreasonable nonsense. And of course, being a utilitarian, I agree with Harris that value exists in the universe as a certain fact. As true as any other fact, like that the Earth is 93 million miles from the Sun, or that the Sun is primarily composed of hydrogen and helium. So it is a fact that a sentient being burning alive in a forest fire is bad. I liked how Gary said that nihilism should be more accurately called denialism, because that's what it is. Denial of the factual reality and everything that it implies. Yet there is a right answer and a wrong answer. Your subjective opinion doesn't matter when held up against truth claims that are supported by a mountain of evidence, like evolution. I have to admit that I did not enjoy making this video. I'm glad that Ask Yourself finally responded to me, even years later, because exposing people to anti-natalism is always a good thing. By the way, we do tend to spell it like this without the hyphen. He didn't even get to the main arguments for antinatalism, like consent and imposition arguments, the asymmetry between pleasure and pain, or even the fact that a new person is more likely to grow up to be a carnist rather than a vegan. The is-ought is nonsensical when applied to the intrinsic bad, like pain, because no normative theory is needed, as pain cannot be anything other than bad. So there is no judgment being made. It just is, and the ought is built in. Arbitrary ethics is obviously less effective than utilitarianism. So my suggestion for Ask Yourself is to get off the nihilist train and hop on board the rational train, because all of the anti-realist nonsense is not helping the cause of animal liberation. People are just going to watch those videos and say, well, that doesn't make any fucking sense. To be opposed in metaphysics and metaethics is such a wide distance that it's like trying to find something in common between an atheist and a theist. I live on planet Earth, and he lives on planet Denialitron. Well, that's all for now. Thank you for watching.